So last month I completed my big project on the British A30 Challenger tank, and in the video you may have seen one vehicle that looks a lot like the Challenger but not quite, and that would be the SP2 Avenger self-propelled gun. And this is a very interesting vehicle because it is the one and only offshoot of the Challenger, which itself was an offshoot of the Cromwell. And what the Avenger did was take the modified Cromwell hull that was developed for the Challenger and also mount the same 17-pounder gun, but then in a configuration for the Royal Artillery as a self-propelled gun. Now, in the main video I already covered this doctrinal split between 17-pounders in their towed and self-propelled configurations for the Royal Artillery, and then the tank-mounted guns for the Royal Armoured Corps that then included the Challenger as well. So what I want to do in this video is focus on the Avenger, this self-propelled gun, and then how it differed from the Challenger, both as a consequence of its different role, but also due to more refinements in the design as well. That is what makes it a very interesting vehicle, is it shows some of the things that the Challenger could have incorporated had it been a more fold-out design. So just to briefly summarize, self-propelled guns are used more defensively, so they don't have the same demands as a tank, although especially by the end of the war they do start growing into the same sort of vehicle, but more on that later. To go back to the beginning, both the Avenger self-propelled gun and the Challenger cruiser tank have the same origin point, that being in August 1941, when the British first express a need to mount the new heavy 17-pounder anti-tank gun that is still in development at the time on both their existing and future tanks, so upgunning them. And that immediately runs into problems because the British tanks at the time are still very small and there's just no way of mounting a 17-pounder in a turret of an existing tank. Now, one option is to not mount it in a turret, but to just install it on the hull to create a self-propelled gun. And one existing British tank that is picked for this role is the Valentine, which then leads to the SP1 Archer. And this actually looks a lot like what the Germans did with their Marder, for example, and that you take an outdated small tank chassis, you just strip the entire superstructure away, no more turret ring, and you then install this heavier gun just directly onto the hull, which is essentially reduced to like a sort of a tractor chassis. And in the case of the Archer, it was the 17-pounder mounted to the rear of the Valentine hull, so over its own engine deck, which created quite an awkward configuration. But that was at least one way of using an existing British design, actually the most produced British tank, the Valentine, and then make it a self-propelled gun, the 17-pounder. And of course the downside is it didn't have a turret and it was also quite slow. The Valentine wasn't a fast tank, but it was very low profile, and that is something the British really wanted from a self-propelled gun, having it this sort of a stealthy, concealable ambush type of weapon. Now, one other source of tank hulls that could be modified into self-propelled guns came from across the Atlantic through American Lend-Lease. And the Americans were actually developing their own version of the self-propelled gun concept, which they called the gun motor carriage, which were then organized in what the Americans called their tank destroyer force. And one of the most produced of those tank destroyer GMCs was the M10, which was then easily converted into a 17-pounder SPG by the British because it had plenty of room. It had a large turret mounting an American gun, which the British did not like, but it wasn't a lot of trouble to just put a 17-pounder in, and that would create the M10 Achilles, which had a turret, which was nice. It wasn't a powered turret, so it took a little while, but you could traverse it a full 360 degrees. And it was also fairly fast. However, it was very tall. It was based on the Sherman tank, and like the Sherman, it was about as big as a house, which the British really did not like for their self-propelled guns. Now, so those are the two SPGs that are used during the Second World War in 1944 and 1945. As they are going through their development cycle, there is another option, a superior choice, and that is to do something with the Cromwell tank that is also being designed at the time. And just like with the Challenger, there is this challenge to fit a 17-pounder in it. And this takes until the summer of 1943, until the Challenger design team have developed this new hull. So with the extra suspension unit and then this turret box superstructure, so it can fit this larger turret ring for this larger turret with the 17-pounder that ends up creating the A30 Challenger. And if they hadn't done this, they would have they investigated using just the standard Cromwell chassis, but there was no way to fit a 17-pounder in a turret on that. So it would have been another like Archer, but then on a Cromwell, and that just wasn't, it was a waste of a chassis. They already were developing the Valentine Archer. So the British really wanted to wait until this larger extended hull for the Challenger was developed, before they then started developing that into an SPG carrier as well, which then happened in the summer of 1943. So at that point the A30 hull is going through testing, and it is refined enough that it is now also considered as the basis for a new SPG, which then leads to the Avenger, which has not just a turret, but a powered turret as well, so it has really competitive traverse rate. It is also very low profile, unlike the Challenger and unlike the Achilles. And it is also very fast, of course, being based on the Challenger Cromwell, like a cruiser chassis with the Meteor engine. So, however, it takes until November of 1945 until it takes until February 1945 for the first prototype to be completed, which is a long time considering tank development. And one of the reasons for this is the Challenger is like a sort of a bottleneck. The Challenger development also takes a long time. And the problem is, it is already quite clear that they are not going to be setting up a separate new production line just to produce more A30 hulls for the Avenger. They are just going to produce the 200 Challengers that were ordered in the factory in Birmingham. And only once those 200 were produced, then that same production line would become available for the Avenger. And it was already forecast that it was going to take into 1945 to complete just those 200 Challengers. So it was clear there was no hurry in designing the Avenger, because it was going to be a late war, or as it turned out, a post-war project once that Birmingham production line became available in 45. So February 45 first prototype, and then in November 1945 enough Avengers have rolled off this Birmingham production line that they are issued to active units. But this time the war is over, so those are part of the British Army on the Rhine in Western Germany. And it isn't until April 1946 that the production run of the Avenger is complete at just 80 models. So 200 Challengers were produced and just 80 Avengers. And they remain in limited service. There are two anti-tank regiments stationed in West Germany that use some Avengers. And then in May 1949 they are already pulled out of service. Funnily enough, they're actually replaced by the Archer, despite being an inferior vehicle, because there were just more of them, there were more spare parts, the training was more familiar. With just 80 Avengers, despite being technically superior to the Archer, it was just not economical to maintain them in a demobilized post-war army. However, at the same time, around this time, 1949, the anti-tank rule is also being transferred from the Royal Artillery to the Royal Armoured Corps, and they end up just abandoning the entire SPG concept because they want to standardize on main battle tanks, the Centurion, who also function primarily as a tank destroyer as well. So It's not just the end of the Avenger service, but also the end of the era of the sort of dedicated tank destroyer SPG vehicle. Now, as for the design, it is quite interesting because it shares a lot of familiarities with the Challenger, of course, but it is overall a more refined design while also fulfilling a different role. So it isn't a one-on-one replacement, but it is just it has better components than the Challenger had. The Challenger was a very hasty stopgap design, developed at a time when British tank technology still had a long way to develop, whereas the Avenger, being a late post-war project, could incorporate a lot of technology that had evolved during the war. And it was also designed with a clear rule in mind, being an SPG, whereas the Challenger was always a little bit torn between demands and expectations, which resulted in it being a bit of an awkward stopgap design. Now, regarding mobility, it was nearly identical to the A30. It used the same automotive components, with the only major difference being that the Avenger had return rollers, so little wheels that support the top of the track. However, this wasn't unique to the Avenger because the British Comet had them as well. So this was more a general evolution in British tank design. It was one of the major complaints of the Cromwell and the Challenger, that they could quite easily throw their tracks, and then adding return rollers helped prevent that. Now, firepower was again the 17-pounder, but quite significantly it was a later mark of the 17-pounder. The major handicap of the Challenger was that it used the Mark II 17-pounder, which was a very early simple conversion of the towed 17-pounder that still wasn't really optimized for use in a cramped tank turret, and that resulted in a lot of the problems with the Challenger were just down to the early mark of the 17-pounder. However, the Avenger gets the much more refined Mark VII 17-pounder, which in turn is based on the mark that was used in the Sherman Firefly, and that was converted in a number of ways to fit it inside this Sherman turret. So that greatly helped the Avenger in just being a more space-efficient, having a more space-efficient fighting compartment. Yeah, one of the consequences was that the loader was now seated on the left-hand side of the breech, which was the American layout. Typically the British had the loader on the right, but because they were using Shermans and they adjusted the 17-pounder for the Sherman Firefly, they had to copy the American layout. So in the Avenger, you had the commander and the loader, they were on the left of the turret, left of the gun, and then the gunner had the entire right side for himself. And another nice benefit was that the Avenger could have 12 degrees of gun depression, which was a bit more than British tanks. So with a lot of effort, the Challenger was designed for 10 degrees of gun depression, which was the standard of British tanks. Self-propelled guns ideally would have had 15 degrees of gun depression. They couldn't quite make that on the Avenger, but 12 degrees was still a very respectable amount of gun depression for any type of armored vehicle. Now, another interesting note regarding firepower is that firing trials of the Avenger actually showed that the APC-BC armor-piercing ammunition from the 17-pounder was more accurate than the British were used to from the 17-pounder. That was one of the complaints, that it was, it was a powerful gun, but it had accuracy issues at longer ranges. However, the commentary with the firing trial states that this almost certainly isn't due to the mounting in the Avenger, but probably just a refinement in the design and production of the 17-pounder as well as its ammunition. So the gun is being improved in those later marks compared to the earlier versions that were used and had accuracy issues. And another interesting thing is that the Avenger, as far as I know, is the first British fighting vehicle to have a dedicated ready rack for APDS Sabo ammunition. So this was a wartime development that only saw use in late '44, and that meant that a lot of British tanks and SPGs that were used during the war weren't built with this special type of armor-piercing ammunition in mind. And especially the Challenger, because it was such an early design, its ammunition stowage wasn't even designed with APC-BC in mind, just a plain AP shot that was first developed for the 17-pounder. Whereas the Avenger, being a later design, actually had this 6-round ready rack, which was nearby for the loader, and it was specifically dedicated to having this very potent APDS ammunition. So if a heavily armored tank became a target for the Avenger, then the loader could quickly grab this APDS ammo and give it the greatest chance of going through heavy armor. So that is an interesting sort of development of the 17-pounder and its ammunition that is then reflected in the ammunition storage layout on the Avenger. Now, moving on to protection, that's where the major differences are between the Avenger and the Challenger. Regarding the hull, there isn't that much that has changed. It is mostly the turret box. So that is this extended superstructure that was made to increase the diameter of the turret ring on the Challenger. And on the Avenger, they just lower it a little bit. Apparently that was just something that could have been done, probably on the Challenger as well, so that made it a bit less of a target. The thickness was still the same, but it was now at the same height as the rest of the whole roof. In the turret, that's where the major differences are. So the turret is lower profile than the Challenger, and it is also open-topped, because that was one of the demands for a self-propelled gun, so the crew would have better situational awareness just sticking their head out of the open turret. The protection of the turret was less than on the Challenger. The front plate of the Avenger's turret was vertical, like the Challenger and the Cromwell, but it was just 50 millimeters thick, whereas even the first models of the Challenger already had a 63 millimeter armor plate, and that was already being criticized as being inferior, so that is a clear downgrade on the Avenger. And then later models of the Challenger, of course, had a increased turret plate to over 100 millimeters. So the Avenger, it's half the protection, but the turret is also half the size, so you win some and you lose some. But yeah, most significantly, it is open-topped to comply with this demand for a self-propelled gun. However, this actually proved out to be a bit of a design flaw during the campaign in Western Europe, because the Germans knew that the Allies were using these open-topped fighting vehicles, and they would counter them by firing air-bursting artillery. So the high explosive shells refused to explode in midair above their targets, and they would shoot down their splinters into these open-topped fighting compartments. So it actually became a very explicit demand by Royal Artillery officers that their SPGs had to have some sort of hard top cover on them. So during the development of the Avenger, it is fitted with a roof, although it isn't welded onto the top of the turret, so it doesn't create a fully enclosed turret like on a proper battle tank, but it's more of a canopy-like structure. So there's bars holding it in place above the open-topped turret. So you still have 360 degrees of vision if you stick your head up above the edge of the turret, but then you also have an 8 millimeter canopy roof protecting you from air-bursting shrapnel. And you couldn't crawl out between the roof and the edge of the turret. You had to use the hatches that were on top in the roof plate itself. So it is starting to approach protection levels of what you could expect from a tank. It's like a very long vision slit almost. So you do have some additional situational awareness. You do lose out on protection as well. But in terms of like evacuating the tank, you are now reliant on having these hatches just like on a battle tank. So the protection offered by this roof was put to the test. They fired 25-pounder HE at it, air bursting it, which showed that the metal roof did provide protection against splinters as long as the shells burst beyond 10 feet. If they burst closer, then there was a very high chance of splinters going through the roof and into the fighting compartment. But it did provide some protection. So yeah, that's the Avenger. It's an interesting vehicle. Didn't see any action, only saw very limited service, but it does show that there was room for improvement on the Challenger as a concept, both to evolve it into a self-propelled gun, but also refinements that could have been introduced more on a battle tank type of vehicle as well. And that is, I think, one of the things that I also cover in the main video, is that there was a lot of room for improvement and refinement on the Challenger that was just never really given to it, because the Comet was already in development. The Sherman Firefly proved to be a better stopgap. So I think the Avenger proves that there could have been a bit more effort and design put into the Challenger. But anyway, as a self-propelled gun, just seen on its own, it's also an interesting vehicle, because it is overall just a really good self-propelled gun. It did exactly what the Royal Artillery wanted from such a vehicle. But like a lot of good self-propelled guns, tank destroyers, by the time you really start developing them into a competent fighting vehicle, you are essentially just making a battle tank. And that is sort of they made themselves redundant by doing almost all the things that a battle tank could do, but then not quite. They were held back from being a proper tank. Whereas in terms of weight and size and the amount of tonnage they took up in shipping and production costs, they were approaching that of a battle tank. So in the end, self-propelled guns kind of made themselves redundant, and that's what you see post-war as well, especially with something like the Avenger compared to something like the Archer, which is significantly cheaper, is there just isn't really a point to having something like an Avenger when you can just have a proper tank. And that is something you see with a lot of armies in the post-war period, is they ditch the entire tank destroyer self-propelled gun concept and just start using battle tanks instead. So hopefully this has been a interesting little bonus video to the video over on the main channel, and showing just a little bit more about the entire Challenger cruiser tank family. Thanks for watching.